Andrzej Sapkowski, a Polish fantasy writer and publicist, is widely known in his homeland, Poland. Here, his contribution to the country's culture is highly valued. The author gained worldwide fame through the saga of the Witcher Geralt of Rivia, whose story in world literature began as early as 1986. Andrzej Sapkowski, who graduated from the University of Łódź, worked in his profession for many years. He was a foreign trade specialist, a man who was hardly short of money, even in socialist Poland. Nevertheless, the Warsaw Pact has long since passed into history, and we know Sapkowski as a writer and publicist. In the late 80s, and in the early 90s as well, the creation of the Witcher fantasy universe truly became a kind of breakthrough. It is no surprise that the saga has millions of fans all over the world, and that the author's works have been translated not only into 12 European languages, but even into Chinese. Of course, today the ideas embedded in the structure of The Witcher's world are by no means new, but for socialist Poland, they were clearly somewhat ahead of their time. Now, Sapkowski's universe has given rise to video games, comics, and a Netflix series. However, we will still try as far as possible to limit ourselves to the book canon, because it remains the foundation of the entire grand franchise. So, what is the history of the world that gave birth to Geralt of Rivia, beloved by so many readers? Continent is not the only name of the universe we have come to love. Strictly speaking, it is not even a universe, but a separately taken part of a certain multiverse with a single planet. It is called the world, the earth, or the globe. The Elves, who arrived before humans, sometimes called a planet by the name of their race, Ain-Shay, trying to show by this that the world should have belonged to them. Confusing? Perhaps. But honestly, understanding the chronology system of this world is even harder than remembering all the names. Without going too deeply into details, the continent is one of the planets of the multiverse where, by a combination of circumstances and the author's will, the events briefly presented here in chronological order take place. As in any world, global cataclysms periodically break out here too. One of them resulted in the thinning of the boundary between worlds, which was called the conjunction of the spheres. Migrants from neighboring worlds of the multiverse poured onto the continent. The saga also features Ain-El, the world of the Elves, from which the Ain-Shay probably came, as well as Camelot, the world of King Arthur. In one interview, Sapkowski admitted that he wanted the continent to be, as it were, our prehistoric Earth, but in the end changed his mind. Apparently, it was impossible to do entirely without the real Earth, and so a kingdom from the mythology of the ancient Britons appears in the saga as another world. It would seem that the conjunction of the spheres would have become the point of reference, but no, that point became the resurrection. Not inclined to name exact dates, Andrzej Sapkowski thoroughly confused his narratives, and so errors and anachronisms may creep into the dating of events. Let us simply count these errors as a feature of the world in which our beloved heroes live, and not become desperately picky with the storyteller. In the ancient history of the continent, remembered only approximately, the world was inhabited by dwarves. Exactly how many millions of years ago they appeared in this world cannot be said with certainty. Perhaps not millions at all, but merely thousands. The second to come into this strange world were the gnomes. The two eldest races of the continent lived mostly in peace, dividing spheres of influence without great bloodshed. Before they appeared, the lands belonged only to the glacier. It covered the space where Cadwen would later arise, drawing mountains and the waterways of the lake country on the map of the world. Humans, meanwhile, originated and evolved 5 million years before the events known to us in a completely different world. The continent was gradually being populated, but by very different creatures. A little later than the dwarves and gnomes, dryads appeared on the continent. Many mysterious legends shroud the history of these beings, but most still agree that dryads are the indigenous inhabitants of the continent. They were born together with the forests, whose bond they carried through millions of years. All the misfortunes to which these guardians of nature were subjected greatly changed the Dryads. And in Brokilon, we will already see a race that sincerely hates everyone else. In the period from 2230 to 240 years before the resurrection, the Ain Shay arrived on the continent. They came on their white ships even before the conjunction of the spheres, spreading through the northern lands. They fought the dwarves and gnomes for a place under the sun. They also, for purposes now unclear, altered the Dryads, probably seeking to bend the ancient race to their will. Possessing the power, the Elves easily became the dominant race, and who could have thought that they were destined to lose their position in confrontation with humans? Other testimony about ancient times, such as the existence of purple bison or phallic cults, is not very reliable. Though, who knows? Who knows? The conjunction of the spheres struck in 240 years before the resurrection, and the first humans appeared on the continent. These were the peoples of the Dauk and the Vosgor, who settled in the north. It is claimed that humans came from their native world after having destroyed it themselves, but Dauk and Vosgor were only the first swallows, and the great migration of humankind was still ahead. Along with the conjunction of the spheres, vampires, ghouls, and other distorted entities appeared on the continent, not all of which can be classified as sentient. In the period from the conjunction of the spheres to the resurrection, which marked the beginning of our era, the cult of Melitele arose on the continent. In the book The Last Wish, the cult of Melitele is described as follows. The cult of the goddess Melitele was one of the oldest, and at one time one of the most widespread, and went back to immemorial, still pre-human times. Almost every non-human race and every primitive, still nomadic human tribe worshipped some goddess of harvest and fertility, patroness of farmers and gardeners, guardian of love and the domestic hearth. Most of the cults merged, giving rise to the cult of Melitele. Time, which dealt rather mercilessly with other religions and cults, securely isolating them in forgotten, rarely visited churches and temples, lost in city quarters, treated Melitele mercifully. Melitele still lacked neither followers nor patrons. Scholars analyzing the popularity of the goddess usually turned to the most ancient cult of the Great Mother, Mother Nature, pointed to connections with natural cycles, the rebirth of life, and other grandly named phenomena. At the same time, human writing arose, the first runes. This alphabet was composed of Elven runes and Dwarven ideograms. For many centuries, the temples of Melitele taught writing in the first runes, even after humans had acquired other symbols for writing. As everywhere else, information about prehistoric times is brief and fragmentary. It does not even contain an exact indication of what exactly this resurrection was that is considered the first year of the new era. The retreat of the glacier? The invasion of the continent by humans? Who can say now? It is known that from 10 to 750 years, humans actively arrived on the continent. They had destroyed their native world and now took up the seizure of new lands. In general, the fate of the elder races in Sapkowski is even sadder than in that of other luminaries of the fantasy genre. The humans of the Polish writer openly strive for genocide and do not hide it. More than that, while creating beings such as witchers, mutants, they later disowned them as well, classifying them as non-humans. Still, let us return to the next human expansion onto the continent. The ancestors of the Nilfgaardians, and it was precisely they, arrived on lands inhabited by the Black Shay. This distinct cultural group of elves eventually mixed with the arriving humans. Indeed, judging by this information, the Nilfgaardians are true non-humans. Interestingly, they are proud of their origin and of the fact that they speak one of the variants of the Elder speech. Their hostility toward other humans, who came to the continent later than they did, also becomes understandable. Around 760, the Elves founded their necropolis in Fencarn, on the territory of Sodden. This cemetery is known for the large quantities of mandrake that grow there, with many female specimens among them. Certain well-known vampires use mandrake to make moonshine. Well, who would have thought? The times before the arrival of the ships of the exiles are sometimes called the Dark Ages. The first landing, or the Landing of the Exiles, took place on the 25th of February, 764. More humans arrived, the very ones who became the ancestors of the Nordlings, that is, the inhabitants of the northern kingdoms. They landed at the mouth of the Yaruga and in the delta of the Pontar. 4 ships brought passengers to the continent, and these passengers united into 3 kingdoms: Sintra, Temeria, and Redania. One of the newly arrived Nordlings, Jan Becker, managed to master the power while still on the ship. He was able not only to calm the waves with its help, but also to place it in the service of his community. Moreover, Jan Becker did not stop there. He began testing all children for the presence of a source, rightly reasoning that people would need more mages. Jan Becker's actions clearly showed people that magic could bring not only harm, but also tangible benefit. However, for most people, the magical arts, as before, remain something incomprehensible and therefore dangerous. As a result, in 764, the Novigrad Union was concluded between the rulers of the human kingdoms and representatives of the castes practicing magic. Magic was, as it were, separated from the state, while sorcerers were ordered not to interfere in politics and were forbidden to lay claim to royal power. Representatives of mages, druids, and the priesthood took part in the signing of the Novigrad Union. Despite the deep disagreements among these 3 communities, for ordinary people, all these adepts of secret arts remained beings possessing magical abilities. Therefore, on behalf of those who did not possess such abilities, the first human kings signed the treaty. The Novigrad Union also instructed mages not to enter into conflict with one another. Thus, the Brotherhood of Sorcerers was born, since humans possessing the power found themselves, as it were, outside both law and states. Not all mages, however, agreed with such innovations. On the side of the mages, Jan Becker, Geoffrey Monk, and Paolo Giambattista took part in signing the Novigrad Union, while non-magical people were represented by the first kings, Desmod and Sambuk. History has not preserved the names of the priests and druids. The most interesting thing is that the city of Novigrad, which became such an important point in human political life, was founded before humans appeared on the continent. At the moment of the conjunction of the spheres, a passage between worlds opened in that place. It became one of the points through which the elves arrived. Here they founded their settlement as well. On the site of the interworld passage, they built a temple dedicated to the moon. When the first human ships appeared in the Pontar Delta, the elves were forced to leave the settlement. In its place grew a city that, under human rule, began to develop rapidly. Alas, we do not know the exact date when Novigrad became the capital of the Kingdom of Redania. In 772, priests arrived in Novigrad. The not new and therefore rather powerful cult of Creve, goddess of the sky and thunder, strengthened itself in the kingdom. This cult, by the way, cared nothing for the Novigrad Union. The priests actively interfered in worldly affairs, turning rulers and common folk against mages, druids, and the servants of other more nature-oriented cults. Despite the fact that Creve is presented as a deity associated with initiative, activity, creative thinking, growth, and the protection of property, the actions of the cult can quite be called destructive. Clashes with druids and the priesthood of Melitele among Creve's followers always occur against the backdrop of activity that harms nature and the environment. In addition, the followers of Creve suffer from uncompromising xenophobia. Quite possibly, had such a powerful cult not appeared, humans might have found it easier to coexist with the peoples who had previously inhabited the continent. Between 764 and 830 of the first millennium, several more fateful events took place, for which, unfortunately, history has not preserved exact dates. For example, Geoffrey Monk managed to achieve peaceful relations with the elves of Lochmune and Est Hamlet. He succeeded in persuading the Ain Shay to teach gifted human children the basics of magic. It was the initial connection of the first mages with the elves that caused the priests of Creve to treat sorcerers with hostility. On the other hand, possessing a source did not yet guarantee the ability to control it, and in that case the bearer of the gift became dangerous to others. Unfortunately, Geoffrey Monk's efforts were almost in vain. Only a few years after he established good relations with the elves, the Redanian commander Milan Ropenek led troops into the lands of the Lower Pontar. He mercilessly destroyed the Elder race in an effort to seize land. Of course, the priests of Creve were not absent either. Ropenek completely slaughtered the elves in Lochmune and Est Hamlet. The bloody Second War with the elves ended in the massacre at Sherwood. Even King Radovid of Novigrad eventually understood how destructive such a policy was, and already in 768 personally ordered the poisoning of his overly aggressive cousin, that same Milan Ropenek. Alas, the consequences this war had for the elves could no longer be stopped, and humans, already at the dawn of time, acquired irreconcilable enemies in the face of all the elder races. Still, one should not consider the elves innocent victims. In roughly the same way they had cleared a place under the sun for themselves before humans arrived on the continent. The hundreds of hacked skeletons of Vrons in the dungeons of Lochmune are proof enough. Meanwhile, the sorcerers settled in Myrte, where the heart of their brotherhood was located. In 781 to 782, events occurred that are mentioned in the books as the Civil War in Toussaint. It is completely unclear why people consider this a civil war. A certain King Louis, seeking to seize the fertile lands of Toussaint, went to war against the local elves. After a series of bloody battles, the Elven king, Divataf, came to the conclusion that capitulation was the only way to save his people from total extermination. He surrendered to Louis and swore allegiance to him, while leading his kin into the mountains. However, this was not enough for Louis, and he continued to humiliate his defeated opponent. Then, Divataf devised a cunning plan involving magic in order to kill Louis. Unfortunately, nothing came of it. In 782, while celebrating the conquest of Toussaint, humans staged a pogrom under Mount Gorgon, during which Divataf died, along with many of his subjects. For long centuries, fierce elven resistance continued in Toussaint, and King Divataf's sophisticated plan of vengeance turned into a delayed action bomb that Geralt of Rivia would later have to deal with. In 800, the capital of Redania was moved to Tretogor. Novigrad gained considerable independence and power in the person of the hierarch. From 830 to 836, the 6-year war flared up between Sintra and Temeria. History preserved no details, only that the Temerian court mage, Raffard the White, was ultimately able to extinguish the conflict by reconciling the warring parties. By the way, this very Raffard the White belonged to those mages who did not accept the Novigrad Union. He served as an advisor to the mentally impaired king of Temeria and, in fact, ruled the country. In 836, the Brotherhood of Sorcerers created the chapter and the council. Herbert Stammelford, Aurora Henson, Ivo Rickert, Agnes of Glanville, Geoffrey Monk, and Radmir of Torcarned distinguished themselves in this undertaking. Do you think the mages of the chapter were such idealists? Not at all. They destroyed dissenters no less thoroughly than humans destroyed the elder races. In this unequal struggle, Raffard the White fell, along with many others who disagreed with the opinion of the majority. The lady mages did not waste time either. Agnes of Glanville, Aurora Henson, Nina Fioravanti, and Clara Larissa de Winter managed to master the magic of all 4 elements. The last of them, by the way, founded a magical academy for girls in Aretuza. In 839, Emil Regis Rohelic Terzif Godefroy was born. Why is this important? Simply because Geralt of Rivia was bound to the wise vampire by a true friendship. Though, of course, the higher vampire Regis was not always wise. In the second half of the 9th century, the War of the Daggers broke out in Temeria, also nicknamed the Endless War. Ordinary people spoke of it like this: the war was long, several centuries of slaughter. enough for many generations, and for what? So that yet another little prince could sit more comfortably on the throne. Interestingly, the quarrel between the Dukes of Maribor and Elander over the Temerian throne really did prove quite prolonged, though not for several centuries. Around the 850s, the mentally deficient king Abdonk died, without the support of Raffard the White, who had perished in the war between mage individualists and the newly formed chapter. Abdonk managed to hold power for no more than 2 years. He left no heirs, and the rulers of Elander and Maribor began feuding over the royal crown. Each accused the other of killing the king and built his claim to the throne upon that accusation. In the end, after almost 100 years, the Maribor branch won with the help of the mage Alzur. Adalbert came to the throne in Vizima. The new king tried to reconcile with Elander by granting it considerable autonomy. Still, years of bloody slaughter never passed without consequence. In the 10th century, kings unexpectedly became concerned with clearing the lands of monsters, and not merely concerned. They wanted, you see, a kind of superhuman for the task, someone able to deal with powerful monsters alone. Naturally, they turned to the mages, but the sorcerers considered such work beneath their dignity. If you yourself do not want to do something but the task must be accomplished, you have to shift it onto someone else. Only, onto whom? An ordinary human cannot manage it, and maintaining the whole armies to fight the multiplying evil is expensive and ineffective. So in the middle of the 10th century, the mage Alzur of Maribor, together with his teacher Cosimo Malaspina and his student Idaran, began experimenting on unsuspecting children with weak signs of magical talent. To carry out these inhuman experiments, the mages chose Caer Seren, which would soon become the Tower of the Griffin, one of the most important strongholds of the Order of Witchers. The research was crowned with success, but the price proved high. Of 38 children of different sexes, only 5 boys survived the mutations. The fate of Alzur himself may be considered retribution. Having stepped away from the affairs of the Witchers' order, the mage decided to occupy himself with creating monsters. What did he want to add work for the Witchers he had just helped create? One way or another, one of his creations killed the unlucky sorcerer and half destroyed his native Maribor, where Alzur was breeding his monstrosities. While the rulers of Maribor and Elander gnawed at each other over the Temerian throne, in Redania, Radovid I, also known as the Great, decided to distance from court his fiercely hated brother Troidan. This happened around 960. Perhaps handing his brother Kovir along with the title of Appanage Count was a bad idea, but constantly fearing for one's life in one's own home was an even worse one. At the same time, the defiant daughter of the king of Cadwin, Aideen, fled to Kovir. A little later, Troidan's descendant, Gedovius, married Gemma, who traced her line from Aideen. This couple became the first king and queen of the independent kingdom of Kovir. Still, it is better not to run so far ahead. Around 1067, a major uprising of the Elves took place. Aeliren, the White Rose of Sherowed, inspired young elves to desperate resistance against humans. On the whole, the elven youth are not hard to understand. Humans, driven by greed and the ideology of the cult of Creve, did not merely drive the elder races from their settled lands. All the efforts of human kings and priests did not end simply with taking land and riches. The invaders sought to humiliate and then altogether destroy the defeated who did not belong to their race. One might think that Aeliren raised her people for a noble cause, but no victorious holy crusade came of it. Humans proved stronger and more numerous than the elves. Aeliren's army, even despite the support of the Mahakam dwarves, was utterly defeated by humans, and most of the young elves perished. Some young elves still regard the White Rose of Sherowed as almost a saint, but that is by no means the majority opinion. By her mad act, Aeliren destroyed not only practically the entire young generation of the Ain Shea, she robbed her people of a future and doomed them to slow extinction. For among elves, only the young are capable of reproduction. The defeat of Aeliren's uprising drove the elves still farther into the mountains. They were forced to destroy the beautiful Shaerrawedd with their own hands so that it would not fall to the enemy. The loss of elves capable of bearing children and the forced relocation to barren lands promising the dying race a cruel death. That is what the White Rose of Shaerrawedd achieved. Aeliren's uprising was the last major center of elven resistance to the advancing humans. Thereafter, the irreconcilable Aenshe turned to guerrilla warfare, without which they simply could not survive. They died with her name on their lips, repeating her summons, her cry. They died for Shaerrawedd, because Shaerrawedd was a symbol. They died in a struggle for stone and marble, and for Aeliren, as she had promised, they died worthily, heroically, with honor. They preserved their honor, but doomed their own race to destruction, their own people. At the beginning of the 12th century, King Vizimir I, also known as the Old, was born. He received his nickname because, as the younger brother, he could not initially count on the throne, yet still obtained it at the age of 52. The most interesting thing is that this king lived to the age of 96, fully justifying his nickname. And while Vizimir remained in the status of a non-heir prince, his elder brother Radovid III, also known as the Bold, ruled Redania. He was apparently nicknamed the Bold because of the wars he unleashed, while the common people called him the Red for the color of his hair. Still, this did not prevent Radovid III from being an intelligent, perceptive, but incredibly greedy and stingy king. While waging war against Aedirn, Radovid III desperately needed funds. Therefore, around the 1120s, he decided to impose taxes on the Principality of Kovir. Here, the warlike Redanian ruler met resistance, even together with an ally in the person of Cadwin. He failed to defeat the proud principality. The war ended with Kovir's victory and the signing of the First Treaty of Lan Exeter. The provisions of this treaty are numerous, but its general spirit is described in the following. The sea is free and open, trade is free, profit is sacred, your neighbor's trade and profit are the same as your own. To hinder anyone's trade and profit is to violate the laws of nature. Later, such treaties were signed more than once, but the basic meaning remained the same. The victory of Kovir and Povis over two much stronger states is itself a peculiarity, but what does not happen in magical worlds? In 1130, the elven sorceress Lara Dorren gave birth to a daughter, Rhiannon, by a human mage. Rhiannon would become that ancestor of Ciri who bound the girl to Ithlinne's prophecy. Rhiannon was later deprived of her mother, who was cruelly persecuted for her relationship with a human. Lara Dorren left her to be raised by Queen Sero of Redania, who adopted the half-elf and gave her her own name. In the 1140s, King Radovid III of Redania dies, and the throne is taken by the sole heir, Vredank the Elf. Naturally, the king of Redania was no elf at all, but received the nickname for his outward beauty. On the whole, his reign was not something exceptional, but a problem arose in matters of succession that led to a change of dynastic branch on the throne of Redania. Vredank's first wife was Beatrix of Kovir, and from this marriage, Falca was born. Unfortunately for many, the marriage of then Prince Vredank proved unhappy. Having met the beautiful Sero, Vredank sent his unloved wife and daughter Falca to Kovir and married the woman he loved. By doing so, he, of course, gave rise to the heiress's fierce hatred, and when Sero gave birth to two sons, Falca immediately lost the status of heiress as well. As a result of King Vredank's imprudent behavior, Falca not only grew up with hatred in her heart, but also managed to raise an uprising in an attempt to seize power in Redania. In the 1150s, a real bloodbath broke out in Redania. Falca not only succeeded in raising a peasant revolt, she managed to kill her father, stepmother, and both brothers, and kidnapped the pregnant Rhiannon, who by that time was already married to Goidamar of Temeria, taking her away with her. The pregnant rebel did not stop with atrocities in her own kingdom. The rebels attacked Myrte, killed sorcerers, and burned the ancient city of Gaelibol. In the end, already heavily pregnant, Falca crossed the Pontar and declared war on Temeria. She established herself in the Hotborg castle, By that time, Rhiannon had gone mad in captivity. Both women gave birth at the same time. Queen Rhiannon of Temeria bore twins, while the rebel Falka bore one girl, whom she abandoned to care of the maddened captive. The would-be Queen of Redania continued her campaign, but miscalculated badly. Goidemar of Temeria loved his wife. He threw all his strength into crushing the rebellion, and the she-devil Falka ended her life at the stake. Rhiannon returned to her husband. A little later, she even recovered from her madness. But she was never able to remember which of the 3 children were her own and which was the foundling. Goidemar summoned mages to determine this, but did not insist too strongly. In the end, the royal couple had 3 children: Fiona, Amavet, and Adela. The mages concluded that Falka's daughter was Adela, but they never disclosed this to the king. Perhaps the mages were mistaken. A certain prophecy claims that the descendant of Falka must destroy the old world, and that privilege fell upon Ciri's shoulders. Then, does that mean Falka's daughter was Fiona? There is still no answer to this question. After the suppression of Falka's uprising, everything seemed to settle down. Goidemar and Rhiannon took the throne of Temeria, while Vesemir I was crowned in Redania. In 1156, the future king of Cintra, Coram II, was born. In the 1170s, misfortunes once again rained down upon the Temerian dynasty. First, an outbreak of plague raged in Vizima. The disease claimed the life of Princess Adela, who selflessly helped priests care for the sick. A little later, Count Roger Kameni and his men killed Prince Amavet. The jealous count failed to endure the role of cuckold with dignity, and so he hired bandits and went to ambush Amavet, who was allegedly involved with his wife, in the forest during a hunt. Count Kameni and his thugs brutally dealt with the heir prince, but they could not remain unpunished. King Goidemar, enraged by the manner of his son's murder, ordered the aristocrat quartered along with his mercenaries, thereby provoking an armed revolt of the Temerian nobility. Queen Rhiannon, unable to survive the death of 2 of her children, died. Goidemar, having received help in suppressing the revolt from King Liam of Sidoris, married the Siderian princess Ada in gratitude. In 1173, on the night of Beltane, Yennefer of Vengerberg was born, the future beloved of Geralt of Rivia. In 1178, the Temerian princess Fiona, the last daughter of Goidemar and Rhiannon, married Coram II, the heir prince of Cintra. It was into this family that she passed the burdening legacy of Lara Dorren and the Elven prophecies. In 1186, Yennefer graduates from the academy in Aretuza and becomes a full-fledged sorceress. In 1192, the dean of the Barnard Academy, Artemon of Asguth, anonymously published a work entitled The Monster, or a description of the Witcher. In this opus, Artemon slandered witchers in every possible way, and not without reason. 2 years later, a mob inspired by his writings attacked Kaer Morhen. Maddened fanatics killed 40 apprentices. They spared not even small children. And as for the fate that awaited the renegade mages who carried out the mutations, it is scary even to imagine. 23 full witchers also fell in this pogrom, unprepared for such battles. The authorities of Kaedwen reacted very strangely to this event. The king ordered the execution of several random small fry who happened to be caught, and simply waved away the fact that the instigators had managed to escape. The events of 1194 practically crossed out the future fate of the School of the Wolf, which trained witchers in Kaer Morhen. The murder of the mages brought the carrying out of quality mutations to the brink of impossibility. After that, Kaer Morhen could only fade away. In 1211, as many as 3 important figures were born. The future king of Kovir and Povis, Esterad Tissin, who would have the misfortune to rule during the Second War with Nilfgaard. Ciri's grandfather, the future consort of Queen Calanta of Cintra, Rognar of Ebbing. Only 7 years later would his future wife be born. And also, finally, not yet a witcher, but simply a boy, Geralt of Rivia. Well then, for the intrigue to begin, everything is perhaps ready. In 1229, Geralt of Rivia sets out on the path so that, upon completing this peculiar practical examination, he may endure a dreadful trial and become a full-fledged witcher. He was given no easy time. Public opinion, stirred up by Artemon of Osguth, strongly condemned the blackened name of witchers. In that same year, the future companion of Geralt, the bard Dandelion, was born. In the 1230s, unfortunately without an exact date, the Emperor Fergus var Emrys was overthrown in Nilfgaard, and a usurper ascended the throne. The Emperor's son, Emhyr, was cursed. The mage Brathens turned the prince into a humanoid hedgehog, fully in keeping with the meaning of his name. In fact, the heir to the throne was supposed to be killed, but with the help of Ardal Abe Dai, he managed to escape. Having secured himself on the throne, the usurper unleashed a full-scale invasion of the northern kingdoms. To begin with, in 1239, Nilfgaard annexed Ebbing. However, the usurper did not remain in power for long, and the Nordlings managed to fight him off. Despite the danger from outside, in the 1240s, King Heribert of Redania managed to quarrel with the Brotherhood of Sorcerers. And although the king himself ruled only briefly, the boycott declared against him by the mages continued for a long time. Dissatisfied with teaching, in 1247, Dandelion decided to devote his life to poetry and set out to wander. A year later, he would meet Geralt. In 1250, after spending half a year with Yennefer, Geralt leaves the sorceress without saying goodbye, leaving behind only a rose on the bed. In 1252, the cunning Emhyr var Emrys, under the name of Duni of Erlenwald, marries Pavetta, the heir princess of Cintra. Very soon they have a daughter, Cirilla. However, the eyes of the happy father are fixed on anything but his northern family. At first, it had seemed that Duni and Pavetta truly loved one another. Alas, the son of an emperor, even a deposed one, remains forever the son of an emperor. Thus, only 3 years later, Emhyr, with the help of the sorcerer Vilgefortz, attempts to flee from Cintra to Nilfgaard, taking wife and daughter with him. The reason is Ithlinne's prophecy, which Vilgefortz shared with Emhyr. Of course, the renegade mage pursued exclusively his own interests, and for a time they merely coincided with the interests of Emhyr, who sought to regain his position in his homeland. Pavetta learned of the conspiracy of Vilgefortz and Duni Emhyr. She managed to take Ciri off the ship and leave her under the protection of her grandmother, Calanta. When, in the middle of the open sea, Duni and the sorcerer learned of Pavetta's actions, the princess was forced to enter into a struggle with her husband and his accomplice. Princess Pavetta died in the storm caused by the clash, while Vilgefortz transported Emhyr home to Nilfgaard. It was time to reclaim the throne. For Cintra, however, including for Ciri and Calanta, the prince and princess died during a sea voyage. Only a year later, in 1257, Emhyr var Emrys reclaimed the imperial throne of Nilfgaard. It was not for nothing that he had spent several years in Cintra. For the northern kingdoms, this emperor would be far worse than the usurper. Already in 1263, Nilfgaard, under Emhyr's leadership, unleashed war, and Cintra was destined to fall first. The own father of the heir princess, without the slightest hesitation, arranged a genuine slaughter in the kingdom. However, Emhyr failed to capture the princess. In the confusion, his defiant daughter managed to escape. Yet, Emhyr had more serious problems. The First Northern War ended in defeat for the Nilfgaardians after the Grand Battle of Sodden. The united army of Aedern, Cadwin, Temeria, and Redania, supported by the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, defeated the invader and forced him to retreat. Some northern lands, including Cintra, remained under Emhyr's rule, and the emperor had no choice but to continue searching for his daughter, regarding whom he had entirely unambiguous matrimonial plans. Needless to say, Ciri's escape did not happen without Geralt. 2 years later, we can quite well find the princess attempting to undergo Witcher training at Kaer Morhen. However, the girl did not succeed in becoming the first Witcheress in history. The legacy of Lara Dorren, magical talent, awakens in the fugitive princess of Cintra. That is why from 1266, Yennefer undertakes Ciri's training in magic. In 1267, the rulers of the northern kingdoms met in secret at Hage, presented at the council where Vesemir II, king of Redania, Foltest, king of Temeria, Henselt, king of Cadwin, Meve, queen of Lyria and Rivia, and the initiator of the meeting, Demavend III, king of Aedern. Their majesties had gathered in order, for once, to discuss joint action against the Nilfgaardian invasion. True, the measures they intended to take seem rather strange. For example, the kings decided to destroy the Skoya Tell. It is clear that Emir von Emrys' attitude toward non-humans radically differed from what was accepted among the Nordlings, and the rebels supported Nilfgaard in every possible way in its invasion. And yet, the kingdoms themselves were in no hurry to take active action against the invader, seeking to shift the burdens of the struggle onto partisans from lands already conquered. The most interesting, and cruel, decision of the Secret Council of Rulers concerned Ciri. Of course, Cintra had to be liberated, only no one intended to give it to its lawful heiress. Because of the dark prophecy following which Emperor Emir searched for Ciri throughout the entire north, it was decided simply to kill the girl. If only the conspirational kings had known that the Emperor of Nilfgaard, even without Ciri, had rights to Cintra. It would hardly have changed their plans, but it might perhaps have altered their view of the situation a little. The innocent princess, who, besides, wished to become either a witcher or a sorceress, had absolutely no desire for marriage, incest, or the bearing of heirs. Only no one bothered to ask her opinion, not even people as close as Geralt of Rivia. While the kings were secretly deciding what to do about the empire, Emir, counting on surprise, decided to strike preemptively and attacked first. The Second Northern War began on the 1st of July, 1267. Was the signal for the beginning of the war the coup on Thanedd and the collapse of the Brotherhood of Sorcerers? Or was the blame the interception and murder of the royal messengers sent from Redania to Aedern? Probably all together, though in any case the war was unavoidable. Emir var Emrys could in no way reconcile himself to the humiliating defeat inflicted upon him by the Nordlings at Sodden Hill, and in any case, the Emperor intended to punish the mages responsible for his disgrace. Here, the Novigrad Union played a cruel joke on the sorcerers. Officially belonging to no state or bloc, the mages divided within the Brotherhood into sympathizers with the northern kingdoms and supporters of Nilfgaard. It was precisely between these factions that the bloody clash eventually occurred, in which Geralt and Ciri had to take part. The consequences of the open clash among mages themselves proved highly unpleasant. Francesca Findabair, an elven sorceress, led the Nilfgaardians into Thanedd by means of portals. For such a service, Emir var Emrys made her Queen of Dol Blathana, sincerely counting on the help of the Skoyatel in the coming war. The sorcerers finally lost the trust of the northern monarchs and were forced to leave their places at royal courts. In place of the fallen Brotherhood, at the beginning of August 1267, the sorceress Philippa Eilhart created the Lodge of Sorceresses, striving to reconcile the opposing sides, perhaps among mages, but they still failed to stop the war. After all these twists of fate, Ciri ends up in a gang of young cutthroats and eventually falls captive to Leo Bonhart, who had been sent to deal with the gang. By good fortune, Bonhart had entirely different plans for Ciri, which allowed the princess to escape, only in an attempt to return by portal to Thanedd. Ciri enters the famous Tower of the Swallow, also known as Tor Zerael, and ends up in another world, the Elven Ainel. Meanwhile, the Second Northern War moves steadily toward the turning point that came in March 1268 at the Battle of Brenna. After this battle, Nilfgaard's success turned into setbacks, In the end, Emir Var Emrys was forced once more to retreat to Sintra and enter negotiations. On the 2nd of April 1268, the Peace of Sintra was signed. To secure himself in the conquered kingdom, the Emperor of Nilfgaard marries the false Ciri, whom very many nonetheless took for the true princess. By that time, at least Geralt had guessed that Emperor Emir and Duni, the husband of Princess Pavetta of Sintra, were one and the same person. The Witcher was horrified by the Emperor's plans for an incestuous marriage with his daughter. But after the events of the Second Northern War, Emir unexpectedly changed his mind. In attempts to find Ciri, whom her father now intended to leave the crown of Sintra, Geralt of Rivia and Yennefer of Vengerberg die. Their bodies are carried away by Ciri in an unknown direction. The author in fact left the question of the deaths of the main characters open. What is unambiguous is that Geralt and the sorceress irrevocably leave their world, transported by Cirilla and a unicorn into the world of King Arthur. Possibly, Sapkowski does not take his heroes there for nothing, for his interest in the myths of Camelot is widely known. The end of the 13th century brought many upheavals to the world of the continent. What began in the 70s would later be called the Dark Ages. First, the Catriona Plague, and later the witch hunts, whose victims were both mages and those who had absolutely nothing to do with it. Here are several known names of those who ended up at the stake: Philippa Eilhart, Sabrina Glevisig, Sheila de Tankerville, Margarita Lauentil survived the torture but remained alive. Any representative of the magical community became for a full 4 years a target of anti-magical propaganda successfully spread by Willemer, archpriest of the Church of the Eternal Fire. And as soon as the witch hunt ended in 1276, another outbreak of plague erupted again in 1294. From the beginning of the 14th century, the continent was overtaken by climate change, but the density of events gradually declines. In 1309 to 1318, the bloody war of the two unicorns took place in the northern kingdoms. History has not preserved who fought whom. There is only the assumption that these were two branches of the ruling dynasty of Cadwin, whose coat of arms was precisely a unicorn. Interestingly, the Elven seer Ithlinne predicted this conflict as well in times immemorial. In 1350, riders from Hochland descended upon the northern kingdoms. It is claimed that Ithlinne predicted this too. By 1373, most of the Ain-Shay had left the continent, departing through the interworld gate, Ardgaith, into unknown distances. Everything they could not take with them, the elves destroyed so that it would not fall to the hated humans. In 1373, the young Nimue Werch Ulder ap Gwyn sets off for Aretuza. Once, her entire childhood had been steeped in tales of the adventures of Geralt, Yennefer, and Ciri. After graduating from the School of Sorceresses, Nimue will meet Ciri on the shore of the lake, but the princess will leave too quickly, having realized that once again she has arrived in the wrong time. Probably the times with exact dates end here, if one does not count the death in 1510 of the famous historian who described the adventures of Geralt of Rivia. Everything else becomes the distant future for the heroes of the saga, and in that future, Nimue Werch Ulder ap Gwyn helps the lost Ciri return to 1268 in order to reunite with Geralt and Yennefer. Several centuries after the Northern Wars, Nimue Werch Ulder ap Gwyn and Convi Rammers Tilly gather bit by bit information concerning the lives of the heroes of the saga and the ancient prophecy of Ithlinne, which gave so much significance to Cirilla's fate. Meanwhile, the 15-year-old Ciri, fleeing from the wild hunt together with a faithful unicorn Ihuaraquax, ends up in the distant future of her world. She finds there a sad picture, the smell of gasoline penetrating everything and an enormous garbage dump. She does not want to believe that this is her world and the future awaiting her. 3,000 years after Nimue Werch Ulder ap Gwyn completed the task of restoring history, the world rolled into a new catastrophe known as the White Frost. In reality, this same white frost is not a magical phenomenon, but an astronomical one. The planet reached a critical point of distance from its star, and eternal winter came to the continent. Put simply, it is that very new ice age predicted by Ithline. It was from this that the long-suffering Princess Cirilla, child of destiny, master over space and time, was supposed to save the world. Interesting. Will Sapkowski tell us how? And for now, perhaps, we shall say goodbye to the grand saga of the Polish writer and publicist Andrzej Sapkowski. Among critics, rumors stubbornly circulate that Sapkowski not only does not love his characters, he openly despises them. Well, sometimes it truly seems that way, which does not diminish their attractiveness to the reader in the least. The most interesting thing is that the story is still not finished. As recently as 2024, another book about the Witcher beloved by the public was published, telling of his early adventures, Crossroads of Ravens. Sapkowski's world is enormous. Is it strange that the author still has something with which to fill in the blank spots? And perhaps someday we will still learn exactly how Ciri was supposed to save the world. That's all for me. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell. Your support is the best reward for me. Thank you for watching. See you soon. Bye.